mention confessions at church, and most people's minds probably turn to the practice of confession, formerly known as the sacrament of penance, which prevails in the Roman Catholic Church. Although variations of it are practiced in several Protestant traditions, not to mention other world religions. You'd really be surprised if you checked it out. But it's the Catholic practice of confession that we know from cinema and literature, whether or not it's our tradition, if not from firsthand experience. For many, it may provoke reactions ranging from amusement to revulsion and regret. It's an individual experience, I suspect, even if God really is listening in with the priest. For those who've read the early theologians, the Confessions of St. Augustine may come to mind, while those with a Protestant upbringing may think of the historic confessions of the Church, that is, the creedal statements that have shaped the history of Christian thought. And of course, lawyers and those who indulge themselves in true crime stories on television or crime fiction in literature may rub their hands with glee, imagining someone under an intense, bright light while interrogators squeeze a confession out of them, which may come either at the beginning or close to the end of the story, depending upon the kind of tale a screenwriter or author plans to tell. Confessions. There are many kinds. There are also the kinds we make to our beloveds, or to our children as they age, or to our neighbors. Those everyday confessions where we share something of ourselves, something that may be secret or not, with someone else. For me, when I hear the word confession, it's Laura Goodman Salverson's acclaimed memoir, Confessions of an Immigrant's Daughter, that comes immediately to mind. As already noted, it won the Governor General's Literary Award for Nonfiction in 1939, just 2 years after Laura won the Governor General's Literary Award for fiction in her for her novel The Dark Weaver. In 1940, the Winnipeg Tribune reported that she was the first author to receive the Governor General's Literary Award for a second time. And even today, she remains one of only a few authors to receive that honor in more than one genre. She was a remarkable author, and she is ours. As Ginny Martin so carefully and fervently sought to document. People kept telling Ginny there just still wasn't enough evidence. And Ginny kept saying, "How much more evidence do you need? It's obvious." In her published preface to her book, Laura Goodman Salverson acknowledged, "It was not my purpose or desire to write a factual history of this or that village or event. I have been concerned only with the human element, with those joys and sorrows and rare moments of spiritual grace which seem to me to encompass all that any of us ever knows of lasting reality." If that passage doesn't scream about her Unitarian origins, I can't imagine what would. Even as it appeared in print, the book was a personal chronicle of an era that had already passed, and happily so, she maintained. It was a hard era, full of adversity. Not yet 50 at the time, what she called a portrait of a young self one knows to have existed was by then a faded dream, which, with a little courage and a lot of humor, she thought to offer to her readers for whatever insight and inspiration it might provide. If I can offer a small confession of my own, I have generally tried to avoid Icelandic themes when preaching to this congregation. The obvious exception has been when I have been asked to address historical themes, when this congregation's own distinctive Icelandic roots are relevant. Roots that aren't exactly unique, but are exceedingly rare. But its roots are not its branches, and its seed time is not its harvest. What was once the main flavor of this congregation's identity, culturally, if not religiously, is today only a seasoning, and that's fine. So except when it is inescapable, I try not to bring it up here at church. This is challenging for me, since so much of my life outside of the ministry is immersed in the Icelandic community and my ancestral homeland. I am one of only a handful of what might be called professional Icelanders in North America. An assortment of diplomats and business persons, writers and academics, artists and musicians who have carved out a living for themselves by serving the interests of those who suffer from Icelandophilia. It happened more or less by accident rather than design, and while this church contributed to this happy accident, it cannot be blamed for it, even though you may suffer from time to time as a result. So much of the literature I read is by Icelandic and Scandinavian authors. I listen to a lot of Icelandic and Faroese music. Yes, it's a thing. I watch Nordic films and follow the news of the North closely. But I have generally restricted sharing my observations about such things to my social media posts, newspaper articles, and sermons in the Interlake, where they are more organic rather than impose them upon you. This Sunday, and next Sunday, let me warn you, will be exceptions. But I hope that you will see the universal story that flows through the Icelandic story of the early years of this congregation. That you will see something of yourselves in the same way that a tour group that I led to Iceland several years ago, when they stopped at an immigration museum, an immigration center in the north of Iceland, not a single Icelander among them overstayed their presence, perhaps even their welcome, by more than 2 years, because they were captivated by what they thought was a near universal story of the immigrant experience. That story is embedded in the DNA of this congregation. When I announced my topic for today, it was intended primarily for an audience of one. Virginia Martin, Ginny, who was one of a handful of living authorities on the life and literature of Laura Goodman Salverson. Ginny devoted considerable effort over the better part of 2 decades to reawakening awareness of Laura and her accomplishments, striving to see her memorialized in a variety of places, albeit with limited success, and working to see her recognized alongside Canada's other noteworthy women authors. Before Margaret Atwood and Alice Munro, Margaret Lawrence and Joy Kagawa, Judith Urquhart and Miriam Taves, there was Laura Goodman Salverson, and she was ours. And Ginny was committed to reminding people about that. And I'm heartbroken that she isn't here with us this morning to celebrate Laura Goodman Salverson with us. In assessing Laura's work, Ginny herself wrote, "Her writing about the immigrant experience portrays a myriad of issues, many that women still face today. She wrote vividly and clearly about the experience of immigrant and prairie society, such as the labor conditions of domestic and factory workers. She addressed political and social issues in a moving and compassionate voice. Because she decided early to write in English, she became a bridge between the Icelandic community and others. As it happens, Laura Goodman Salverson's life and letters are interwoven with the history of this city, the whole city, and not just one of its immigrant communities, and with the living tradition represented by our congregation, which can trace back to the longings and aspirations of her father, Larus, an immigrant and harness maker who found himself drawn to the rational expression of religion found in this congregation, after he and his family returned to the city following several years of wandering south of the border. Whether it was in search of work or adventure, Larus was seemingly overcome by wanderlust, and the family moved frequently during Laura's childhood. So while she was born here in Winnipeg, she spent her early years in North Dakota, Minnesota, and Mississippi, you may recall. As a result, her school was interrupted by frequent moves, but local libraries became oases of learning for her. And her father is reported to have been a gifted oral storyteller in his own right, spinning out the familiar tales from back home in Iceland. The influence of Iceland's sagas and eddas, its poetry and folk tales, can be seen throughout Laura's own literary creations. Sometimes he went to church, she wrote, preferably to the Unitarian Meeting House, where ideas, not emotions, were exploited. It is as natural to the Icelandic heart to turn to poetry in times of stress as for another to search his Bible, she added. And the demonstrable truth of this assertion explains a lot about our congregation's story. In time, Larus was accompanied to church by his 3 daughters, although his sons remained aloof. 2 of his daughters were members of what was known as the Icelandic Federated Church, while Laura seems to have had a greater connection to All Souls Church, the English language congregation, where she preached on occasion and which had a significant English-speaking Icelandic component to its membership. Her first novel was The Viking Heart, which was published in 1923. It offers a fictionalized account of the experiences and hardship of the early immigrants to North America, beginning in the Old Country and continuing through the inevitable conflicts faced by the first generation born in a new land. Explaining why she wrote the novel, Laura said, "If one has known poverty and suffering, not that genteel poverty of slender purse and shabby carpets, but the brutal poverty where the larder is ofttimes empty and where the frost lines the wall of one's humble dwelling. Then indeed it would seem that only love alone keeps the blood from congealing. Then it is not so hard to understand the courage and endurance of the pioneer. Few struggles would have been born," she said, "except for the light ahead. The great hope ever before the pioneer, howsoever dimly discerned, became for him a veritable light piercing his darkest cloud of poverty. Moreover, there is always a little gladness in life. None know this better than those who have faced actual difficulties. The Viking Heart was followed by 4 novels before she published The Dove in 1933, an account of the Algerian pirate raids of the 17th century, which was meticulously researched and remains an important English language source of information about this tragic episode in both Icelandic and Irish history, although it takes care to separate fact from fiction. Indeed, it is a model of historical fiction, even though some may find it, as I do, just a little too romantic and sentimental. A great book doesn't need to preach any more than a great person needs to wear a sign, Laura told the Women's Canadian Club in 1943. Good books, great books, and earnest books interpret life and inspire ideals. She believed that everyone needs to indulge their creative impulses, whatever gifts they have, if we are to have a happy world. Although she cautioned against faddism, while also warning that many bestsellers are easily forgotten, even if they were commercially successful. Asked at that meeting where she came up with her material, she replied, "I could go home and write about you." In Vancouver, where she had lived for a time, I sit in the waterfront dives and in dime stores, and I listen to people. Then I go home, think about them, and give them a background. I have as much respect for my characters as I have for my neighbors. In many ways, this remarkable woman's work has, for a long time, been underappreciated both by Icelanders and North Americans, notwithstanding the impressive awards she won. Because she wrote in English, she's generally ignored as an Icelandic literary figure, and because she wrote about Icelandic themes, she was often marginalized as a contributor to Canadian English literature. In recent years, though, this has begun to turn around as both Icelanders and North Americans have become reacquainted with Icelandic immigrant history and curious about the Icelandic experience on this continent. Ginny Martin has been one of the key figures in turning around that awareness. Her work to rehabilitate and reacquaint people with Laura Goodman Salverson is yet incomplete. And if I could do one thing for her, it would be to see Laura immortalized in bronze, as Ginny tried more than once to do in the sculpture garden at Assiniboine Park. And to see her finally make it into the dictionary of Unitarian Universalist biography, which kept rejecting Ginny's submissions because they wanted, well, a membership certificate of sorts. And to see her become more aware in our minds, for us to remember her story, to remember that she was a part of this community, perhaps the greatest author that this congregation has produced, and to read her work and see in its words and pages the very spirit of this liberal religious tradition we share. It's unmistakably present. what she learned from her father, Larus, what drew Larus to become a part of this community, what commanded the allegiance of her sisters, and what drew her back whenever she returned to Winnipeg on her wide meanderings. All of that can be found here. The values she cherished, the concern for the impoverished and downtrodden, the concern for both immigrants and the indigenous, her belief that we all need some hope to cling to, a glimmer of a better future to help us through life's tough times. All of this is worth our remembering. As an ethnic writer, addressing themes emerging from the Icelandic community's experience and from the peculiar liberal religion that so many of them embraced, she was able to empathize with the experiences of other immigrant groups, other faith communities, and as an Icelandic woman who dared to write in the English language, a language she first learned when she was 10. She was truly a pioneer. It's unfortunate that her works aren't more widely read today, but we can only hope that as Canadians and Americans seek to better understand the immigrant experience and how religious community interweaves itself with the experience of immigrants, we can only hope that they will turn to first-hand accounts of this remarkable author. Laura Goodman Salverson remains one of the giant figures in the literary and social history of Canada, the Icelandic community, and this congregation. She belongs to us as much as anyone. The closing hymn is number 1052, The Oneness of Everything.